The hall was built to make things feel small. That was the whole point of it. The Grand Conclave Hall of the Vorath Galactic Empire stretched so far in every direction that the ceiling was hidden behind artificial clouds. The walls were carved from black stone pulled from a dead planet, polished until they shone like mirrors. The floor was cold and white, lit from below, so that anyone walking across it seemed to float in empty space. Every surface, every angle, every detail of the room had been designed by the finest Vorath architects with one single goal in mind: to make whoever stood at the center of it feel like nothing. It had worked for 3,000 years. Ambassadors had wept on that floor. Kings had knelt on it. Entire delegations had collapsed before they even reached the speaking platform, simply from the weight of the room pressing down on them. The Vorath were patient, theatrical, and very good at making other species feel like insects. Marcus Dale walked in with his hands in his pockets. He was a tall man, not especially impressive to look at. He had short gray hair, a face that had seen too much sun and not enough sleep, and the kind of eyes that did not move quickly because they did not need to. He wore a plain dark jacket, the standard issue for Earth's diplomatic corps, with no medals and no decorations. His shoes were slightly scuffed. He had not bothered to polish them. Behind him walked two junior staff members, both young, both clearly trying very hard not to look as terrified as they felt. They had read the briefing files. They knew what this hall meant. They knew what it meant to be summoned here. Marcus had read the briefing files too. He just did not seem particularly moved by them. The hall was full. Representatives from 30 alien species filled the viewing galleries above client races of the Vorath Empire, there to watch the ceremony, there to be reminded of what happened to civilizations that said no. They were quiet. They were always quiet in this room. You learned to be quiet when you had been someone else's property long enough. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform of black stone, sat the Vorath High Chancellor. His name was Dravok III, and he was enormous. The Vorath were tall creatures, 8 feet at the smallest, with 4 arms, gray-blue skin, the texture of old bark, and eyes that were entirely silver, no pupil, no iris, just flat metallic light. Dravok wore ceremonial robes of deep red, covered in the symbols of every system the Empire had ever conquered. There were a lot of symbols. The robes were very heavy. This was also intentional. Beside him stood the Imperial War Herald, holding a scroll. The scroll was long. It was always long. The Declaration of Absolute Conquest was a document the Vorath had refined over centuries, and it was designed to be read aloud in full, slowly, so that every word had time to land. Marcus reached the center of the floor and stopped. He looked up at Dravok. Dravok looked down at him. Then the herald began to read. The declaration covered everything. It named humanity's crimes against galactic order, which consisted mainly of existing in space the Vorath wanted. It described the glory and the history of the Vorath Empire in considerable detail. It explained, at great length, the total military superiority of the Empire and the total hopelessness of any resistance. It listed the terms of surrender, which were simple. Humanity would hand over its 3 outer colonies within 72 galactic hours, reduce its military to a token force, and accept a Vorath governor on Earth. In exchange, humanity would be allowed to continue existing. The herald read for 40 minutes. The junior staff behind Marcus shifted their weight. One of them was gripping his data tablet so hard his knuckles had gone white. The other was staring at the floor, breathing very carefully through her nose. Marcus stood still. He did not fidget. He did not look around the room. He watched the herald read, the way a man might watch rain fall present, but not particularly concerned. When the herald finally finished and rolled up the scroll, the hall went completely silent. It was the silence of a room full of people waiting for a reaction. The galleries above leaned forward. 30 species held their breath. This was the moment. This was when the human would understand what had been said to him. This was when the fear would arrive. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a cigarette. Then he pulled out a small metal lighter, clicked it once, and lit the cigarette. He took a slow, long drag, and exhaled a thin stream of smoke that rose lazily toward the artificial clouds above. The silence broke, but not the way it usually did. The hall did not erupt in the sound of a broken species. It erupted in something between outrage and disbelief. The Vorath. Consider fire, a sacred element. To burn something in the presence of the High Chancellor without ritual permission was not merely rude, it was a religious offense of the highest order. Several of the Vorath guards took a full step forward before a sharp gesture from Drevok stopped them. Drevok's silver eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression that had ended civilizations. Marcus looked back at him. He took another drag. "Are you finished?" Marcus asked. His voice was calm, not calm like someone trying to seem brave, calm like someone who had genuinely not been frightened. Drevok's voice, when it came, was like a stone dropped into deep water. "You stand in the presence of the Empire. You have been given the terms of your surrender. What is your answer?" Marcus looked at the cigarette for a moment, as if thinking about something else entirely. Then he looked back up. "So that's a threat," he said. "Or are you still warming up?" One of his junior staff members made a very small, very quiet sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, or might have been a suppressed scream. Even she was not entirely sure. Drevok stood. When a Vorath of his size stood to his full height, it was meant to remind every other creature in the room of how large the universe was, and how small they were. It usually worked. Marcus did not step back. "You will have your answer in 72 hours, Marcus said. "I assume that's still the deadline." He turned without waiting for a response, and walked back the way he had come, his shoes making soft, unhurried sounds on the glowing white floor. The hall stayed silent long after he left. In the viewing galleries, 30 species watched the human walk out. They had all been in that room before, in one form or another. They had all felt what the room was designed to make them feel. None of them had ever seen someone light a cigarette in the middle of it. A Vorath intelligence officer sitting in the back of the hall quietly opened a file on his datapad and began typing a new report. He was not sure how to classify what he had just watched. He was not sure there was a category for it. He titled the report, "Unknown Behavioral Profile Human Ambassador Priority Review." Then he paused and changed the priority from standard to urgent. Outside the hall, in the wide corridor of black stone and cold light, Marcus walked steadily toward the exit. One of his staff fell into step beside him. "Sir," she said, her voice very low, "they just declared war on us." "I know," Marcus said. "And you lit a cigarette." "I did," he said. She waited. He said nothing else. "Was that the plan?" she asked. Marcus took a final drag and crushed the cigarette out against the wall of the Vorath Grand Conclave Hall, leaving a small dark mark on 3,000 years of black stone. "Part of it," he said. The clip spread fast. Someone in the viewing gallery had recorded it on a personal device, just a small handheld thing. Low quality, shaky at the edges, but it was clear enough. You could see the herald finish reading. You could see the silence. You could see the human reach into his pocket. You could see the small flame of the lighter catch. And then you could see the smoke rise, slow and easy, in the grand conclave hall of the Vorath Galactic Empire, while the High Chancellor stared, and every guard in the room held their breath. The clip was 43 seconds long. Within 6 hours, it had been watched 11 million times across the galactic network. Within 12 hours, the number was over 100 million. The reactions were not all the same. Among species that had been under Vorath rule for generations, there was a strange energy in the responses, people watching it over and over, not saying much, just watching. Among Vorath citizens, the reaction was fury, clean, and simple. Among the outer systems that still maintained some independence, there was a different feeling, entirely something cautious and curious, like watching a small animal walk up to a predator and yawn. The title that spread fastest, the one that got attached to the clip on almost every platform, was not in any official language. It was a rough translation that someone had written in a comment early on, and it had stuck. The human just shrugged. In the Vorath Intelligence Bureau, on the 14th sublevel of the station, a room full of analysts stared at screens and tried to work out what had just happened. The Bureau was not used to confusion. It was one of the best intelligence organizations in the known galaxy, funded generously, staffed with sharp minds, and backed by 3,000 years of experience studying other species. They had files on humanity. They had built those files carefully over the last 60 years, since humans had first appeared in deep space, blinking and curious, and not entirely sure how their faster-than-light drives worked yet. The files were not small. But they were, it turned out, missing some things. The lead analyst on the human profile desk was a Vorath named Sethvak. He had been in the Bureau for 20 years and was considered reliable and thorough. He pulled up everything they had on Marcus Dale and read it again, carefully, looking for something that explained the cigarette. The file said, Marcus Dale, age 54, Earthborn, assigned to Outer Colonial Diplomatic Corps, 11 years ago, prior to diplomatic service military. The military section was brief. The humans had not shared detailed service records, and the Bureau had not pushed hard to get them because, frankly, Earth's military had not seemed like a priority concern. They had ships. They had weapons. But so did 100 other species, most of them more advanced. Earth was small. Earth was new. Earth was not, the Bureau had concluded, a significant threat. Sethvak read the military entry again. Prior service, 12 years. Various postings. Conflict zones listed, 7. The names of the conflicts were unfamiliar. They were internal human wars, the kind the species was embarrassingly prone to having with itself. The Bureau had always noted this as a weakness. Humans fought each other constantly. They could not even agree on basic things. Surely a species so divided among itself could not pose a serious external threat. Sethvak drummed his fingers on his desk. He pulled up a second file not on Marcus specifically, but on human conflict history in general. He had read it before, but he read it again now. The file was long, because human history was long and very bloody. They had been fighting wars on their single planet for as far back as their records went. Not small fights. Big ones. Wars that killed millions. Wars that burned cities flat. Wars that lasted for years and decades and, in some cases, for what felt like forever. And then, every single time, they had stopped, buried the dead, fixed what was broken, and started again. Sethvak sat back. There was something in that pattern that he had always filed away as a flaw, as proof that humans were chaotic and self-destructive. But sitting here now, with the clip playing on a loop on the screen beside him, he started to think about it differently. A species that had fought itself that many times and survived was not fragile. It was the opposite. He opened a new document and began to write. He wrote about persistence, how human hunters on their home planet had chased prey, not by being faster, but by never stopping, walking for hours and days until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. He wrote about their physiology, how they could function on less sleep than almost any other spacefaring species, how they processed pain differently, how their bodies were built to recover from damage that would permanently disable most others. He wrote about their psychology in war, how external threats historically collapsed internal divisions almost instantly, turning dozens of quarreling nations into a single focused force. He wrote, "We have been measuring this species by the wrong scale." Then he wrote, "They have never been conquered. In their entire recorded history, not once." He flagged the report as urgent and sent it to his department head, a senior official named Vrath, who had been in the Bureau for 30 years and had the particular confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong. Vrath read the first paragraph. Then he called Sethvak. "You're suggesting," Vrath said slowly, "that we have made an error." "I'm suggesting we may not have the full picture," Sethvak said carefully. "The Chancellor has already issued the declaration." "I know. The fleets are being positioned." "I know that too." There was a pause. Vrath's voice, when it came again, was flat. "Your concern has been noted, Sethvak. Focus on monitoring human communication channels for signs of panic. That is your assignment." The call ended. Sethvak looked at his screen. The clip was still playing. The human lit the cigarette, exhaled, looked up at the Chancellor. He watched it 3 more times. Then he opened a private channel, one that went outside normal Bureau routing, and forwarded his report to someone else. Someone in a different department. Someone who he thought might actually read it. Across the station, in a guest suite that the Vorath had provided for the human delegation, Marcus Dale was watching old football recordings on a portable screen and eating something he had brought from home, a flat, dense food that one of his staff had once described as a biscuit, though it did not look like anything the Vorath had a category for. His staff were not relaxing. They were working. Asha, his senior aide, was on a secure line to Earth, giving a situation report. Kofi, his communications officer, was monitoring galactic network activity and tracking how the clip was spreading. "It's everywhere," Kofi said, not looking up from his screen. 43 species at least. The framing varies. Vorath-aligned channels are calling it an insult to the Empire. Independent channels are calling it... He paused. They're mostly just calling it the shrug. "Good," Marcus said, eyes still on the football. "Good?" Aisha looked at him. "Sir, with respect, good? Every species in those galleries has been under Vorath rule for years," Marcus said. "Most of them have never seen anyone walk into that hall and not look afraid. Right now they're watching that clip and asking themselves a question." Asha waited. "They're asking," Marcus said, "whether it's possible." He reached for another biscuit. "We're not fighting the Vorath fleet," he said. "Not mainly. We're fighting the idea that the Vorath are unstoppable, and the best weapon against an idea is a different idea." He glanced at Kofi. "How many views?" 140 million, as of 2 minutes ago. Marcus nodded slowly. "Let it spread." He turned back to the football. His team was losing, but it was only the first half. He was not worried about that either. The War Cabinet met within 3 hours of the declaration. It was held in a room deep inside Earth's Colonial Defense Command, a gray, practical building on the outskirts of Geneva that had no decorative stone, no artificial clouds, and no glowing floors. The lights were ordinary, the chairs were ordinary, the table was ordinary. There was coffee, though the machine was old and the coffee was bad. And everyone drank it anyway because no one had time to complain about it. 17 delegates sat around that table. They represented the major human governments, the Colonial Authority, the Defense Council, and 2 independent bloc leaders who, 6 months ago, had been in the middle of a trade argument so heated that it had nearly ended in sanctions. Both of them had dropped that argument entirely the moment the emergency signal came through. They had not discussed the trade dispute since. They did not intend to. The lead of the cabinet was General Ida Ferreira. She was 61 years old, small and lean, and very direct. She had run 3 major colonial defense operations, lost good people in 2 of them, and had learned from all of it. She did not waste words. She stood at the head of the table and said, "The Vorath have given us 72 hours. We are not going to spend those 72 hours panicking. We are going to spend them working. Everyone clear?" Nobody argued. That was how you knew it was serious. She laid out the situation plainly. The Vorath Empire had positioned 3 primary war fleets within strike range of humanity's outer colonies. The colonies in question, Kephara Station, the Delos settlement, and the mining complex on Vara, had a combined civilian population of about 400,000 people. The Vorath expected those populations to be there when they arrived, because the Vorath believed the declaration alone would be enough to freeze humanity in place. "They think we'll be too scared to move," Ferreira said. "So the first thing we do is move." The evacuation order went out within the hour. Not a rushed, panicked evacuation, a clean, organized one. Humanity had protocols for this. They had written those protocols after a hard lesson in their early colonial days, when an asteroid impact on a small mining settlement had killed everyone because no one had practiced leaving. After that, every colony above a certain size ran evacuation drills twice a year. Every civilian knew their route. Every ship had a designated load list. Kephara Station began emptying in under 4 hours. The Delos settlement took 6, because it was larger and had more medical cases to manage. The Vara mining complex was the fastest. The workers there had spent years in deep space, and they knew what real danger felt like. They were loaded and gone in 3. The Vorath, monitoring from a distance, saw the evacuation begin. Their analysts reported it to Fleet Command as possible panic behavior. Fleet Command decided it meant the humans were breaking. They did not consider the other possibility. While the colonies emptied, a second set of orders went out. These went to military engineers and logistics teams who had been stationed at those colonies under cover of civilian roles, because humanity had learned, again, through hard experience on its own planet, that you never left a border undefended just because it looked peaceful. The engineers did not leave with the civilians. They stayed a little longer. They planted mines. A great many mines. Smart ones, the kind that could tell the difference between an approaching civilian vessel and an approaching warship. They put them in the approach corridors, in the docking rings, in the orbital lanes. They put them in places that looked empty and safe and obvious. Then they left. The colonies sat quiet and dark, waiting. Back on the Vorath station, Marcus was conducting what he called negotiations. The Vorath did not want to negotiate. They had said what they wanted. They were waiting for the answer. But Marcus had requested a series of meetings with various Vorath officials, citing the need for clarification on terms. And the Empire had agreed, because refusing to meet with an ambassador during a declared ceasefire window was technically a breach of galactic protocol, and the Vorath cared about the appearance of following their own rules, even when they planned to break everyone else's. So they met with him. And Marcus asked questions. He sat across from a Vorath logistics commander named Deathrack and asked, politely and with great apparent innocence, about the supply chain for the war fleets. Specifically, he asked how the Empire managed fuel resupply past the Cathara gravity belt, which he had noticed created some complications for long-range transit. Deathrack, caught off guard by the specificity of the question, answered more than he meant to before he caught himself. He met with a Vorath fleet admiral and asked, while casually looking at his notes, whether the Empire's combat pilots operated on a rotation system or used chemical stimulants for extended operations. The admiral stared at him for a long time. Marcus smiled and said he was just curious about standard practices. The admiral said nothing, which was itself an answer. He met with a Vorath cultural attaché, the closest thing to a diplomat the Empire had, and asked how many of the 43 client species had formal loyalty agreements versus compulsory arrangements. The attaché asked why that was relevant to a surrender negotiation. Marcus said he wanted to understand the full scope of what he was agreeing to become part of. The attaché did not like this framing. He answered anyway, in vague terms that still said more than he intended. Asha watched all of this from her chair in the corner of each room, taking quiet notes, and each time they left, she asked the same question. Are we actually negotiating? We're learning, Marcus said each time. Learning what? Everything they didn't put in the briefing files, he said. After the fourth meeting, Kofi pulled him aside and reported that Earth's signal analysts had confirmed what Marcus had suspected from the logistics commander's slip. The Vorath Third Fleet had a resupply dependency that routed through a single relay station. If that relay was disrupted, a third of their strike capacity would have to pull back within 11 days. Marcus nodded. He sent an encrypted message to Ferreira. It was 4 words. Relay station. Third Fleet. He got a reply 6 minutes later. Also 4 words. Already on the list. He had assumed it would be. On the 68th hour, with 4 hours left on the deadline, Marcus requested one more meeting, this time with Drevok himself. The Chancellor agreed. He sat in a smaller room this time, still impressive, still designed to dominate, but nothing like the conclave hall. He looked at Marcus across a wide stone table, with the flat patience of something that had never needed to hurry. You have come to deliver your answer, Drevok said. It was not a question. I've come to ask one more thing, Marcus said. Drevok was quiet. In your 43 conquered systems, Marcus said, how many of them fought back? The Chancellor's silver eyes were still. All of them. And how long did the longest resistance last? A pause. 14 years. The Heshka Confederacy. Drevok's voice carried something that was almost respect for the memory. They were determined. But determination without capability is only a delay. Marcus nodded slowly, as if thinking that over. How long? Marcus asked. Did it take you to break them? 14 years, Drevok said again, and the pride in his voice was clear. 14 years, and they had still won. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The last major war on Earth lasted 6 years. The one before that? 5. We've been fighting ourselves for 100,000 years. He paused. We're faster than the HFY. He stood. You'll have our formal answer when the clock runs out. He left. On hour 72, the answer was delivered in writing, via official diplomatic channel, stamped with Earth's colonial seal. It read, "We decline." 2 words. No explanation. No plea. No offer to negotiate the terms of surrender. Just, "We decline." The Vorath war fleets began to move. They arrived at Kafara Station 6 hours later, weapons hot, ready for resistance. They found empty corridors and dark docking rings, and the kind of silence that a building only has when it has been carefully and deliberately emptied. Then the minds began to wake up. The first Vorath fleet entered Kafara Station's orbital lane and immediately lost 11 ships. Not to weapons fire, not to a waiting human fleet, to mind small, quiet, patient things that had been sitting in the dark for less than 3 days and had done their job without any fuss at all. The minds did not care how large the Vorath Empire was. They did not care about the size of the warships or the history of 3,000 years of conquest. They were very simple devices with a very simple purpose, and they did it very well. The fleet pulled back to a safe distance and stopped. Fleet Admiral Govrath stared at his sensor readings from the command bridge of the flagship. The readings showed him the same thing no matter how many times he looked at them. Empty colony, no civilians, no military ships, and a field of smart munitions covering every viable approach vector. Someone had mapped this entire approach corridor and filled it methodically, the way you fill a glass steadily, completely, without leaving gaps. This was not what a panicking species did. Govrath sent an urgent report to High Command and waited for orders. While he waited, his analysts began sweeping the sensor data for patterns. They found them. The mine placements were not random. They followed a logic, a precise, 3-dimensional logic that anticipated not just where a fleet would enter, but where it would try to go after the first contact. The mines were not just a barrier, they were a funnel. They were pushing any ship that survived the initial field into a specific corridor. One of his analysts said, quietly, "Admiral, if we follow the only clear path through this field, we will come out here." She pointed at a location on the map. Govrath looked at it. It was a wide area of apparently empty space between the colony and the outer asteroid belt. "There's nothing there," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not according to our sensors." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the kind of expression that said the rest of the thought out loud without using words. He ordered the fleet to hold position. At the Delos settlement, the second Vorath fleet had better initial luck, or thought it did. The approach was cleaner, the mining less dense. They pushed through with acceptable losses and reached the colony's outer platform. Then the platform's reactor core, which had been left behind and rigged very carefully by a military engineer who had been doing this kind of work for 20 years, lit up their forward squadrons like a small sun. It was not a nuclear device. It was not a weapon of mass destruction. It was a standard colonial reactor, pushed well past its safe operating limit and set to go when a Vorath access code which the engineers had known the fleet would broadcast automatically on approach, because that was standard Vorath protocol, was detected. 17 warships, gone. The second fleet pulled back. Their commander sent a report. His report used the word ambush 4 times. High Command received both reports within minutes of each other and held an emergency session that lasted 6 hours. At the end of it, they had agreed on one thing. The humans had planned this before the deadline expired, possibly well before, which meant that when Marcus Dale was sitting in those meetings, asking polite questions about supply chains and pilot rotation schedules, the evacuation was already running, the mines were already being placed, and the answer to the declaration had already been decided. The 72 hours had never been a window for human fear. They had been a window for human preparation. This realization moved through Vorath High Command slowly, the way cold water moves through stone, not fast, but going everywhere eventually. And what it left behind, in the minds of the officers and analysts and commanders who sat with it long enough, was not exactly fear. It was something closer to recalibration. The feeling of a map being revised. Deep in the Bureau's 14th sublevel, in a holding cell that was comfortable by Vorath standards, and which had been prepared for Sethvak after his unauthorized report forwarding had been discovered, the analyst sat on a bench and watched a small screen. He was technically under detention pending review, but no one had taken his access to the general news feed away, possibly because no one had thought of it, or possibly because someone in the system had quietly decided he should be able to watch what happened next. He watched the sensor reports come in. He watched the minefields. He watched the reactor detonation at Delos. He watched the Third Fleet, the one he had noted in his report, had a single-point supply dependency, receive orders to advance on the Vara mining complex, only to find that the relay station it depended on for fuel resupply had gone offline 40 minutes before their departure. He read the technical report on the relay station failure. It was listed as a mechanical fault. He did not believe that for even 1 second. The humans had read his own report, or something very like it, and acted on it before he had been able to get it past Vrath. He laughed. It started as a short, quiet thing and then got away from him and became something longer, which echoed slightly in the small cell and sounded, to the guard outside, quite strange. The guard checked on him. Sethvak waved a hand to say he was fine. The guard was not entirely sure about this, but left anyway. Sethvak looked at his screen. He felt no pleasure at what was unfolding, the losses on both sides, the damage, the weight of it. But he felt something else, the particular, rare feeling of a pattern becoming visible, of understanding, arriving. He had spent 20 years studying other species. He had written file after file about what they feared, what they wanted, how they could be managed. And in 20 years, every species he had studied had operated on the same basic principle when faced with the Empire. Survive if possible, submit if necessary. Humans operated on a different principle. He had been trying to name it since he watched the clip of the cigarette, and sitting in this cell, watching 3 Vorath war fleets stall at 3 empty colonies, he finally found the word. Spite. Not malice. Not aggression. Just a deep, structural unwillingness to accept that the situation was as bad as it looked. An absolute refusal to let the story end the way someone else had written it. He wrote that down. He had nowhere to send it, but he wrote it down anyway. Marcus was summoned back to the conclave hall on the 4th day. He came without being asked twice. He walked in the same way he had walked in the first time, unhurried, hands loose at his sides, shoes still not polished. But the hall felt different now. The viewing galleries were less full. Some of the client species representatives had sent junior staff in their place, which was either a sign of disrespect toward the proceedings or a sign that their senior people were busy having other conversations. Marcus suspected the latter. Dravok was already standing when Marcus arrived. He had not stood during the reading of the declaration. He was standing now. Marcus stopped at the center of the floor and waited. "You mined the colonies," Dravok said. "We evacuated the colonies," Marcus said. "The mines were a separate step. You destroyed our approach at Delos. Your fleet approached a live reactor without clearing it first," Marcus said. "That's a safety issue." Dravok looked at him for a long time. The silver eyes were unreadable. But something in the set of his shoulders, in the way his 4 arms held themselves, had changed from the last time. "What do you want?" he asked. And the question was simple and direct in a way that Vorath High Chancellors almost never were. Marcus reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a cigarette this time. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, actual paper, which no one had used for formal documents in 200 years, and which he had brought specifically because he knew it would unsettle everyone in the room, and set it on the stone table between them. "Earth's terms," he said. Dravok did not move for a moment. Then he reached out with one of his 4 arms and unfolded the paper. He read it. His expression did not change, but the silence that came after he finished reading was a different kind of silence from the ones that had come before. It was the silence of someone doing a very fast and very unpleasant calculation. The terms were clear. Immediate ceasefire. Full withdrawal of all 3 fleets. Return of self-governance rights to all 43 client species. Not a demand that the Empire dissolve, just that it stop holding its member systems by force. A formal, publicly broadcast acknowledgement that the declaration of war had been a mistake, and a seat at a proposed new council of independent species, one vote, same as everyone else, no more and no less. This is not a surrender document, Drevok said. No, Marcus agreed. It's not. You are asking us to give up everything we have built. I'm asking you to give up ownership, Marcus said. That's different from everything. You still exist. You still have your home systems. You still have your culture and your history and your very dramatic architecture. He glanced around the hall briefly. You just don't get to own other people anymore. Drevok set the paper down. And if we refuse? Marcus put his hands in his pockets. Then we keep going, he said simply. We're not in a hurry. He said it the way someone might say it about a long drive or a slow project at work. Not as a threat, just as a fact. A true thing about a species that had been at war with itself for 100,000 years and had come out the other side with the particular patience of something that knows it will still be standing when the problem is gone. Drevok looked at the paper. He looked at Marcus. He said nothing. Take your time, Marcus said. We'll be outside. He turned and walked back toward the exit. He did not look back. Behind him, in the viewing galleries, the junior staff of 30 species were very quietly, very quickly, sending messages to the people they reported to. The Vorath took 9 days. 9 days of closed sessions in the high command chambers. 9 days of arguments between military leaders who said the Empire could still fight its way through this, and intelligence officers who had quietly read Sethvak's report and knew better. 9 days of Drevok, sitting at the head of a long table and listening to both sides, and doing the slow, difficult arithmetic of a leader who has to decide whether pride is worth the price, being quoted for it. Marcus spent those 9 days in the guest suite. He worked. He slept 8 hours a night, which his staff considered remarkable given the circumstances. He watched football. He finished his supply of biscuits from home and had to switch to local food, which he described to Asha as fine, but very purple. He sent daily updates to General Ferreira. He did not send urgent messages. He did not push. He had said they were not in a hurry, and he meant it. On the third day, something else began to happen, something no one had planned for, or perhaps something everyone had quietly hoped for, without saying it out loud. The first independence filing came from the Hethali, a small insectoid species from the system of Velth, who had been under Vorath rule for 60 years. They submitted the filing through Galactic Protocol channels, a formal document, correctly formatted, citing the relevant treaties and conventions that the Vorath had signed back when signing them had seemed like a harmless formality. The filing did not ask for permission. It was a notification, not a request. The Vorath Legal Bureau, already stretched thin by the military situation, filed an objection. Standard procedure. The Hethali sent a second document. It was a counter-objection, citing the same treaties in more detail. Whoever had written it knew the law very well, which was interesting because the Hethali were not known as a species with strong legal expertise. It turned out that 3 Hethali scholars had spent the previous year studying galactic law in complete secrecy, which suggested that not everyone had been as resigned to permanent Vorath rule as the Empire believed. On the 5th day, 4 more species filed. On the 7th day, 11 filed in a single morning. These were not armed rebellions. No one was shooting. No one was marching on Vorath garrisons. The client species, most of whom had no significant military capacity, were doing something that the Vorath Empire, which thought about power in terms of fleets and weapons, had not built a very good system to stop. They were filing paperwork. Correct, legal, binding paperwork, citing the Empire's own treaties, in the middle of a moment when the Empire was badly positioned to respond. Someone, somewhere, had been waiting for exactly this moment, possibly for a long time. Sethvak, still in his comfortable cell, watched the filing count climb on his screen and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who had been right in a way that nobody wanted to hear. He also felt, underneath that, Something heavier, the awareness of all the years those species had spent waiting, and what waiting like that costs. He was not celebrating, he was witnessing. He wrote in his private notes, "We confused patience with acceptance. We thought that because they stopped fighting, they had stopped wanting. We were wrong. They were just waiting for a crack in the wall." He paused, then added, "The human put the crack there with a cigarette." On the 9th day, Dravok sent word to the guest suite. He was ready to talk. Marcus put on his jacket, checked that he had a cigarette. He had been carefully rationing them, and had 2 left, and walked back to the conclave hall for the 3rd and final time. The hall was different. It was not smaller. The architecture had not changed, but it felt less certain of itself. The way a room feels when the purpose it was built for has quietly shifted. The galleries were full again, but the watching faces were different too. They were leaning forward in a way that was not the same as the leaning forward of the first day. That had been the posture of people watching a species be broken. This was the posture of people watching something they had not seen before, and were not sure they had words for yet. Dravok sat at the table. He had aged in 9 days, or perhaps it was just that the careful performance of agelessness had slipped a little. He was still large. He was still imposing. But he sat like a person rather than a monument, and that was new. Marcus sat across from him. "We accept the ceasefire," Dravok said. "We accept the fleet withdrawal." He paused. "The independence filings are a separate matter, governed by treaty law, and will proceed through proper channels." Marcus nodded. He had expected this. Accepting the filings outright was too much to ask for in one conversation. The treaties were already in motion. The channels would handle it. "The public acknowledgement," Dravok continued, and his voice slowed slightly on those words, like a cart going uphill. "We will issue a statement. The content will be reviewed by both sides before release." "That's acceptable," Marcus said. "The Council," Dravok said. "We will participate as an observer. Not a full member. Not yet." Marcus considered that for a moment. Observer was not full member. But observer was in the room. In the room was a beginning. "Acceptable," he said again. Dravok looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "Why did you not simply demand our surrender? You had the position for it. The relay disruption alone would have forced the 3rd Fleet back within the week. You could have pressed further." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Because we didn't want your surrender," he said. "We wanted you to stop. There is a difference?" "A big one," Marcus said. "Surrender means we spend the next 100 years managing a broken empire and a resentful population. Stop means you make a choice. Choices stick better." He leaned back slightly. "Also, frankly, we had 400,000 people to resettle from 3 evacuated colonies. We had enough to manage." Dravok was quiet for a long moment. "Your people have been planning this." "Some of it," Marcus said. "The mines and the reactor, yes. The relay disruption, yes. The independence filings," he paused. "Those were other people's plans. People who'd been working on them for a long time. We just gave them the right week to use them." Dravok looked at him with his flat silver eyes. "You are a strange species." "We've been told," Marcus said. They signed the ceasefire documents. It did not take long. The lawyers on both sides had been quietly drafting them for the past 4 days in parallel, because both sides had quietly known where this was going. When it was done, Marcus stood, and Dravok stood, and they looked at each other across the table with the particular mutual acknowledgement of 2 people who have been through something and come out on the other side of it. Dravok said, "You were not afraid." Marcus considered that. "I was a little afraid," he said. "You have a very large fleet. But you lit the cigarette." "I needed something to do with my hands," Marcus said. "And I wasn't going to give you the other thing you wanted." "Which was?" "To see me scared," Marcus said simply. "That was the whole point of the hall, wasn't it? The clouds, the stone, the speech. All of it was to make me feel small, and I decided I wasn't going to." He shrugged, a small, easy movement of his shoulders. "It seemed important to decide that early." Load. The press conference was held in a neutral corridor of the station, not in the conclave hall. Marcus stood in front of approximately 60 journalists from 30 different species, all of them talking at once, in a sound that resembled a wave hitting rocks. He waited for the noise to settle. It took a while. The first question, from a HFY journalist who was small and quick and had bright compound eyes that caught the light, was, "How did you know it would work?" Marcus thought about it for a real moment. Not a performed pause, but an actual one. "We didn't," he said. "We knew we could make it very expensive for them to continue. We knew our people were safe. We knew the law was on our side, and that other species were ready to use it the moment there was an opening." He paused. "Beyond that, we just kept going. That's mostly what we do." Another journalist. "Were you not frightened when you walked into the declaration? The High Chancellor of the Vorath Empire was threatening the extinction of your species." Marcus looked at the journalist. "He was threatening war," he said. "That's not the same thing. We've had a lot of wars." He pulled out his second-to-last cigarette and lit it, which created a brief but significant stir among the Vorath members of the press. He ignored this. "The thing about being threatened," he said, exhaling slowly, "is that the threat only works if the other person believes it. I didn't believe it. Not because I thought we were invincible, we're not, but because I've seen what humans do when someone tries to end us." He tapped ash on the corridor floor. "We get annoying about it." There was laughter. It came from unexpected places. HFY journalists, a pair of reporters from the Velth system, a small group in the back, whose species Marcus did not immediately recognize. Even one of the Vorath press officers made a sound that might, in a certain light, have been called a laugh. The final question came from Asha, who was not a journalist but was standing close enough, and could not help herself. "What happens now?" Marcus considered the corridor full of cameras and faces and species, and the sound of a galaxy in the middle of becoming something slightly different from what it had been 2 weeks ago. "The colonies get resettled," he said. "The filings go through the legal process. The council gets built slowly, badly at first, the way these things always are." He took a last drag of the cigarette. "And then we all go home and argue about something else." He stubbed out the cigarette, turned to leave. One more voice, from somewhere in the crowd, not a journalist, just someone watching. "Did you always know you would win?" Marcus stopped. He did not turn back around. He stood with his back to 60 cameras, and the watching eyes of 30 species, and the galleries full of people who had spent their whole lives under a power that told them the story was already over. "No," he said. "We just knew we weren't going to lose quietly." He walked out. 3 weeks later, a historian at the University of New Nairobi began writing a paper. She was a young academic, not yet well known, but she had been watching the events of the past month very carefully, and she had a theory about what had actually happened, not the military parts, which would be studied by other people, but the first moment, the cigarette, the shrug. Her paper argued that the war, such as it was, had been decided not in the minefields or the reactor detonation or the relay disruption, but in the Grand Conclave Hall. In the 43 seconds after the Herald finished reading, it had been decided by a single human, making a single choice, not to be what the room was designed to make him. She titled the paper, "The Cigarette Doctrine, on the Strategic Value of Refusing to be Impressed." It became, to her considerable surprise, the most widely read academic paper in human history. It was translated into 31 languages, including 7 alien ones. The HFY translated it first, before the human publishers had even finished the first print run. The Vorath never translated it officially, but a copy circulated quietly through the Bureau's 14th sublevel, passed from desk to desk, until it reached a now-released analyst named Sethvac, who read it in one sitting, made a number of notes in the margins, and then set it down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He had written the same argument 2 weeks before she had. He did not resent her for it. He was just glad someone had said it clearly. Somewhere across the colony systems, 400,000 resettled civilians were moving back into their homes, their stations, their mining platforms. The mines had been cleared, the lights were back on. The corridors smelled like people again. And in 43 systems, very quietly, the paperwork was going through.